Having thundered his judgments, Zephaniah, particularly on Judah, and telling them that God had inspected every little segment of their society and found their ecclesia to be corrupt. And so upon them would come the judgments of the day of the Lord. Well, then Zephaniah proceeded to tell Judah that these judgments would incorporate all the nations around them, that there would be no place for them to hide on that day. And sadly, it was because that they were just like those nations. Their ecclesia was just like the world. Well, Zephaniah is now going to explain the other side of the day of the Lord, that God was going to work with the remnant in Judah, the meek, those who took the exhortation that knowing that Yahweh was in their midst, they hid themselves in the Lord. They waited upon him. And that's why the day of the Lord is not only a day of judgment, but it's a day of love. It reflects the two aspects of the Father's character, doesn't it? His severity and his goodness. It's justice and mercy. It's truth and mercy. And so to look at this section in particular then, in chapter 3, we see that it deals with the restoration and the redemption of Judah. And we notice how God uttered his judgments against Judah and and the nations around them. And so this section is going to deal with their restoration to favor again, both of the nations and the whole of the nation of Israel. And lastly, it's going to describe how God will manifest himself in his great love for his people. Now, just a little note about timing here in Zephaniah. Zephaniah has been dealing with Judah in the days of Josiah and the judgments that would come upon his descendants. And so this section of the book is really forecasting the restoration of Judah after their captivity in Babylon. But just as so many other parts of Scripture have a double application, well, some of this language in this chapter of Zephaniah can only apply to the day of the Lord when Christ has returned. It's our day of the Lord and the ultimate restoration of his people when Christ will sit as king. And so we are going to be involved in the things of this chapter. Well, starting then with the nations converted, verses 8 till 10. And verse 8 starts out with therefore. So it's connecting to what's before. And recall that last week in verses 6 and 7, God expected Judah to learn from his judgments on the nations around them and on Israel to the north as well. But they would not. They continued in their corruption. And so, therefore, he now speaks once again to those of chapter 2 in verses 1 to 3, the meek of the earth who had wrought his judgment. And so, in that day, he says, wait upon me. Now, the word for wait comes from the idea in the Strong's of piercing, properly to adhere to, and so to await. And so really God is saying, look, therefore, ye meek of the earth, be pierced and nailed and so stuck to me, and wait with a longing and persevering expectation, because the day of the Lord will require patience on your part. But remember what it said about the day of the Lord. He said it's coming. It's even speeding along, and there's no stopping it. So it's really just a perceived delay on their part, or our part. And so wait ye upon me, God says. Well, what do they wait for? What are the meek waiting for? Well, he says in the verse, until the day that I rise up to the prey. Now, it's a rather interesting picture that this verse creates, because The question is, who is the prey? Well, when you look at verses 9 and 10, God's not gathering the nations to exterminate all of them, but he's going to refine them and sift them, and sift out that he might obtain those who would confess his name. And so it's those individuals, the ones who will be obedient to him, that he's viewing as his prey, that he wants to find. And so he says he's going to gather and assemble the nations. You know, the nations, it would seem, think that they gather for their own means. They gather for war, to take their own prey. But it says here that God is the one doing the gathering. And we might think of Ezekiel 38, where God says to Gog, I will put hooks into thy jaws and draw thee down. And so the verse goes on to say that I may assemble the nations to pour upon them mine indignation. For all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. Now, the word indignation, the word indignation in the Hebrew, it means to froth at the mouth. I mean, what a picture we get from this word. And the word fierce anger means the burning of anger in the face. We might say someone's so angry that they get red-faced. And the fire of his jealousy, well, it literally means the fire of jealousy. And so, you know, we think about it and we say to ourselves sometimes, well, how much longer is it going to be until Christ returns? And we say, God must look down in such anger at the degree of sin in the world. Well, brothers and sisters, let's not make a mistake here. God is angry, and he's jealous at the institutions of religion and wealth and science and philosophy, which completely delude men from looking to their Creator. They work to remove his very existence from men's minds. But you know, all you have to do is just glance at the odd headline or listen to a little news report here and there, and you can see the angels now at work, gathering and assembling the nations. And just when they think they will accomplish their goal, God's going to pour upon them the full force of his indignation and his wrath. And so God's instruction to us is, wait ye upon me. And you know, sometimes it feels like all we can do is wait. When life seems to be filled with, to use some of the things of chapter 1, those who worship the host of heaven, or those who are turned back from the Lord, who say, oh, the Lord won't do this or do that. And you know, we're completely surrounded by this in the world. And sometimes it even seeps into the ecclesia. Or when we feel tired from the constant gnawing of the flesh upon us. Or when we feel our bodies grow weak and sick because of our mortality. Brothers and sisters, it's all we can do is to wait upon the Lord, to be nailed to him, to be stuck to him, and wait with a longing and persevering expectation. Because soon enough, in verse 9, it says, I will turn to the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. You know, we're back in Genesis again. Zephaniah is appealing to Genesis again. This is the reversal of the Tower of Babel, where in that case, the language and the unity of man were united against God. But here, they will be united in one language with God. And sometimes we say, well, you know, the language of the kingdom, it's going to be Hebrew. And it seems that this verse might actually be implying that, because the commentators say that this verse that talks about one language is the only verse in the entire Bible that contains every letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet. And it says they're going to serve him with one consent. And your margin may have a note there that it's one shoulder. Well, this Hebrew word for consent is actually the word Shechem. Shechem, it's the place, isn't it, that's pregnant with meaning and significance. It's the place where Abraham returned to make a different decision. Shechem is the place of decision. And so this verse is saying that the nations that are left, God is not going to need to coerce them. They will choose to serve God. And so the chastisement on the obstinate nations will lead to the conversion of the others. And this is confirmed in verse 10. It says that from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my suppliants, even the daughter of my dispersed, shall bring mine offering. Now, just to clarify some of the words here in verse 10, suppliant, it comes from the word incense, hence a worshiper. The NET Hebrew notes on this verse, or this word, say, those who pray to me. And the daughter of my dispersed, well, this word dispersed, which simply in the Hebrew means scattered, 31 out of the 66 times that this word comes up in the Bible, it refers to Israel. And the word for offering, well, it's actually the word for a meat offering or a meal offering. And so Kyle and Delitzsch translates this verse 10 as, from beyond the rivers of Cush, they will bring my worshipers, the daughters of my dispersed ones, as a meat offering unto me. And so how interesting that the meat offering was an offering that was to show good works. And so this verse is saying that even the most remotest of Gentile nations will prove that they are the worshipers of Yahweh by bringing the scattered members of his nation Israel back to their land. They're going to help God accomplish his plan. And so that's the restoration of the nations. Well, now turning to Israel. Israel's shame being removed in verses 11 to 13. Now, verse 11 is kind of a bit of a difficult translation. So in that day, in other words, he's hearkening back to verse 8, in the day that God rises up to the prey. Now, some versions have the first half of this verse as a question, but it's actually not in the Hebrew. The King James has it correct. It's stating that there's no need for Israel to be any longer ashamed of their iniquities. And the verse explains it's because those iniquities don't occur anymore. And it says that God will take away them that rejoice in thy pride. Well, numerous translations say, thy proudly exalting ones. Thy proudly exalting ones will be taken away. And it's obviously referring to the princes and the judges and the prophets and the priests of verses 3 and 4 in this chapter. And where it says that they will be no more haughty, well, in the Hebrew, it's the same Hebrew word as pride in this verse. And lastly, the word because, I think there's a note in your margin that says it's actually in or upon. And so putting all of this together for verse 11, the NET does a nice job. It says, in that day, you, Israel, will not be ashamed of all your rebelliousness against me. For then I will remove from your midst those who proudly boast, and you will never again be arrogant on my holy hill. So, my holy hill, why that's Mount Zion, isn't it? That's the place of the temple, the place where so much of the law was meant to teach humility before God, to be shown to him and to others. Well, brothers and sisters, this applies to us too, doesn't it? This is God's ecclesia. And sometimes we might smugly think, well, I'm a Christadelphian and I uphold the truth. I'm one of the few in the world that know the truth. And we can sometimes twist the truth into a source of pride. Our flesh is capable of doing that. But we need to remember that God does not tolerate pride of any sort. And so verse 12, I will leave in the midst of thee an afflicted and poor people, and they shall trust in the name of the Lord. The poor and afflicted, those who know that deliverance will only come through the grace of God, and so they trust in him. This is their leading characteristic. They trust Yahweh. Versus the proud, why they trust in their own strength, in their own accomplishments, in their holiness, and they boast about it. And so in verse 11, it says he's going to remove out of the midst of thee the proud, and in verse 12, he's going to leave in the midst of thee these poor and afflicted. And verse 13 is really saying that these poor and afflicted, why they make up the remnant of Israel, who will finally fulfill what God wanted the nation to be, a holy nation. It says they will do no iniquity. Well, that phrase is in verse 5 where it says God will do no iniquity. And it's actually the same Hebrew word. They're going to be like a flock, it says. They're going to feed. In the Hebrew, it's the word for graze. And they're going to lie down, and none shall make them afraid. And none's going to make them afraid because the roaring lions and the evening wolves of verse 3, well, they've been removed out of their midst. And they're going to have Christ as their shepherd. And you know, brothers and sisters, this remnant of Israel, it's going to be our responsibility as part of that multitudinous Christ to lead them and to teach them of the principles of Christ. Well, our last section starts in verse 14, and we've called it the manifestation of Yahweh. It's going to use such beautiful words that God is going to use to enthuse us about the kingdom of God. And just a note, they say that the verbs in the Hebrew in this section are all in the perfect tense. In other words, they've been written as though it's already happened. That's the surety of these things happening. Well, verse 14 starts with 3 exaltations. Sing, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all the heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. So 3 exaltations and also 3 terms used for the people. They are called Zion. They're called the temple. They're called the nation, Israel, and they're called Jerusalem. Well, Zion, recall, is where the holy hill is. It's referring to the temple. And to call them Israel, why, that refers to them as a nation. And to call them as Jerusalem, well, Jerusalem is the capital. And so it's referring to the government. And with the Lord in their midst, as it says in the next verse, verse 15, he's in their midst. It's really Christ in this case, isn't it? Manifesting the Father. So really, we have here described for us the establishment of the kingdom of God in the kingdom. And you know, these 3 terms, Zion, Israel, and Jerusalem, are only used together of one other event in the Bible. Now, you'll find them in Joel 3:16, but that's really referring to this event, the ultimate establishment of the kingdom when Christ is in the earth. But the only other event that it refers to is in 1 Kings chapter 8, where it says Solomon has assembled the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes, the chief of the fathers of the children of Israel, unto the king in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. And you know, this is the same thing, isn't it? It's the establishment of the kingdom of God, but it's in type. With Solomon, who means peace, in the type as Christ, there in the establishment of the kingdom. And you know, at the end of this 1 Kings chapter 8, at verse 66, it says that on the 8th day he sent the people away, they blessed the king, and went unto their tents, joyful and glad of heart for all the goodness that the Lord had done for David his servant. And that word joyful, which means glad, it's the same word found in Zephaniah 3 and verse 14. And it says that they were glad of heart. Just as in Zephaniah, they were told to rejoice with all the heart. Only in Zephaniah, rejoice literally means to jump for joy with all the heart. Because it's not the type, the real thing would finally be here. And in verse 15, isn't it interesting that there are 3 reasons given for them to exult? And that is that he has taken away thy judgments. In other words, they've been forgiven. Well, those are the issues of the temple, aren't they? He's cast out thine enemy. In other words, he's saved them. He's saved the nation. And Yahweh is in the midst of thee. Well, he's the king. In other words, it's the establishment of the government. And so it says at the end of verse 15, thou shalt not see evil anymore. And so in verse 16 it says, in that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, fear not, and to Zion, let not thine hands be slack. Well, the NET kind of adds a little bit of color to the verse. It says, on that day they will say to Jerusalem, don't be afraid, Zion. Your hands must not be paralyzed from panic. And the reason is given in verse 17. It's because the Lord your God is in the midst of thee. Well, who would it be that's in the midst of thee, representing Yahweh? Well, the verse says that he's mighty. Now, this word mighty, we've seen that before. The word mighty is the Hebrew gabor. It means a mighty man, or by implication, a warrior. And then a verse goes on to say, he will save. In the Hebrew, the words Yah, Shua. Well, that's the word in the Hebrew, the name Joshua. Or in the Greek, it would be Jesus. He's in the midst of thee, and he will be a warrior who will save thee. Now, I don't know if you've noticed as we've gone through the book of Zephaniah, and particularly in this chapter 3, how often we come across the term in the midst of thee. And it creates a story in this chapter, this phrase, in the midst. So in verse 5, the emphasis was that Yahweh was in the midst. He was in the middle, in the very center. And the verse said that morning by morning, he brings his judgment to light. And the result of him being in the midst is that judgment would come on those who would not listen. And these proud ones would be removed. And so the result would be there would only be the poor and afflicted who would be left, those who would listen each morning and crave for the judgments of Yahweh. Well, that would result in the poor and afflicted not seeing evil anymore because Yahweh is in the midst of thee. And why that would result in Yahweh, he who will save thee, dwelling in their midst, rejoicing in joy, resting in his love. And if he's in their midst, why, that means that he's no longer hidden. He's no longer hiding his face, and there's no longer the need for the remnant to be hidden from their oppressors. Well, what would this time be like? What would the feelings be like at that time? And in particular, what would the feelings of the Father and the Son be towards these humble and poor and afflicted people of the Lord? Well, it says in verse 17 that he will rejoice over thee with joy. He will rest in his love. He will joy over thee with singing. So he's going to rejoice over thee with joy. And the Hebrew for joy is to be bright and cheerful. Gesenius says it's from the idea of to spring and to leap. To rest in his love, your margin will say that he will be silent. He will have this unutterable yearning for them in silence, just as they would have had for him. And the word also carries with it an implication that he will remember sin no more. And then it says that there will be this breaking forth into joy over thee with singing. And this Hebrew word for joy literally means to spin around with emotion. And so what a scene, isn't it? That the Father and his Son and us, as part of the multitudinous Christ, will rejoice and be glad over the redeemed remnant of Israel. And then pause and have a silent reflection of love and admiration. And then burst into a dance with this unashamed joy and exaltation. You know, this is describing the emotions of God himself in terms of the emotions of a man, so that we could relate to how God is going to feel about his people at that time. But you know what we need to remember is, if he's going to feel like that about his people Israel, it means that he's already done that in this verse over us at our judgment, when we've been given physical immortality, to be a part of him, to be united with him. You know, in life, we long to love someone, and we long to be loved by someone. And we are going to be loved by the Father at our response to the obedience of his offer of grace and mercy in the knowledge of the truth. You know, this is such an amazing verse that I just had to include this little quote from Barnes' notes. And he says, "This love and joy the prophet speaks of as an exuberant joy, one which boundeth within the utmost self, and again is wholly silent in his love, as the deepest, tenderest, most yearning love broods over the object of its love, yet is held in silence by the very depth of its love, and then again breaks forward in outward motion and leaps for joy and uttereth what it cannot form in words. For truly the love of God in its unspeakable love and joy is past belief, past utterance, past thought." So have you ever thought that our response to the love of God towards us, our behavior and our words as we struggle to live the truth, could affect the very emotions of the Father himself? And yet that's what this verse is saying. Well, verse 18 goes on to say, I will gather them that are sorrowful for the solemn assembly who are of thee, to whom the reproach of it was a burden. It's kind of a difficult translation to kind of grasp what it's saying, but I think the ASV does a bit of a better job. It says, I will gather them that sorrow for the solemn assembly, who were of thee, to whom the burden upon her was a reproach. You know, it's describing them who love and are concerned for the truth, who could either not attend the solemn assembly, or maybe they were in exile, or their leaders made a mockery of it, and it brought reproach upon the truth and upon the ecclesia. And this remnant saw that reproach upon the nation and bore it as a reproach upon themselves, because they loved the truth and they loved their nation and the ecclesia. Well, brothers and sisters, do we sometimes feel that way? Do we sorrow when we're too ill or frail to be in the solemn assembly? Or sometimes when we see the truth or the ecclesia suffer reproach because of controversy, or because the world creeps in and we bear it as a reproach upon ourselves? Well, this verse is saying that God will gather those. And so in verse 19, behold, at that time I will undo all that afflict thee, and will save her that halteth, and gather her that was driven out, and will get them praise and fame in every land where they have been put to shame. You know, this word halteth in the Hebrew is only used 3 times in the Bible. It's used in Genesis 32 of Jacob when he halted upon his thigh. It's used in Micah chapter 4, referring to the regathering of Israel. And it's used here. And so this is speaking of the saving of Israel by the multitudinous Christ from the Esau nations of the world. And in verse 20, at that time I will bring you again, even in the time that I gather you, for I will make you a name and a praise among all people of the earth, when I turn back your captivity before your eyes, saith the Lord. You know, this is a fulfillment of Deuteronomy chapter 26 in verse 19. It uses the same Hebrew words, actually, where Moses said that if they would be obedient, then God would make thee high above all nations which he hath made, in praise and in name and in honor, that thou mayest be a holy nation unto the Lord thy God, as he hath spoken. Well, how far we've come. What a change. What a reversal from the beginning of the book. And you know, if we've suffered affliction, if we feel like we've halted along in life, if we've been driven out, as the verse says, because of infirmity or those who would rule over us of the world, or because yet again we have sin to confess, well, brothers and sisters, he will bring back your captivity. He'll bring back our captivity, just as he brought back the captives from Babylon, and just as he's going to bring back the captives from the coming Russian oppression. He's going to release us from our flesh. Paul says when he ascended on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts unto men. The Father will bring us and gather us and free us from these prison cells, these bodies that we live in, and make us a name and a praise among all people of the earth, along with his chosen seed of Abraham. And so what a change, isn't it? From the beginning of the book. And so much of what Zephaniah says in his book is reversed. Just consider, in chapter 1, verse 18, it described the whole land being devoured by the fire of his jealousy to make a speedy riddance. Well, in chapter 3, the earth is devoured by the fire of his jealousy to restore the nations. In chapter 1 at verse 5, they swear by the Lord and swear by Malcolm. But in this chapter, verse 9, they will call upon the name of the Lord with one consent. In chapter 3 and verse 3, the princes, they were roaring lions and full of pride. In verse 11, those who rejoice in pride are taken away. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. In chapter 1 and verse 4, he's going to cut off the remnant of Baal and the hypocrites. In chapter 3 and verse 12, he's going to leave a remnant who does not lie, in which there is no deceit. In chapter 3 and verse 2, it speaks of those who trusted not in the Lord. At verse 12, it speaks of those who shall trust in the Lord. And in chapter 1 at verse 14, there is the mighty man who would cry bitterly. And in chapter 3 at verse 17, there's the mighty man, the Lord, who would save. And lastly, in chapter 2 and verse 1, they're called a nation not desired. But then they're called the Lord who will rest in his love for his people. And Babylon would come to remove Israel from their land. But in chapter 3 and verse 10, the nations are going to return Israel to their land. So many things are changed and reversed in this prophecy. And so, brothers and sisters, let's summarize that we can't be, should not be like the world and the people around us. We need to fear God and receive instructions from the way that he's dealt with them. Let us remember that God's in our midst, right in the middle, in our center of our lives, and that morning by morning he brings his judgment to light, if only we would avail of ourselves of them through his word. And when it seems that we're halting along in life, then all we can do is wait upon Yahweh. Be nailed to him and stuck to him, and wait with a longing and persevering expectation. And that our God is a jealous God, and he doesn't share his love with other than his people, and he demands that we love only him. And so may we learn from the words through Zephaniah that we might be found among those who were with Zephaniah, among those whom Yahweh hath hidden, on that great day of the Lord, soon to be upon us, a day of judgment and a day of love.